This next test is going to be a voltage drop test on the starter circuit. And with this test, it's going to be very similar to a voltage drop test on the charging system circuit that we did, but we're doing it on the starter this time. Okay, the easiest way to figure out how to do a voltage drop test on a starter circuit is this way. I've drawn a very crude starter circuit up here on the board. So what I've got is my B terminal here, which is the battery wire that comes over here to the battery. And the starter is actually grounded through the chassis. So I've got the starter grounded through the chassis. I've got the battery grounded to the chassis. Over here I've got my DVOM. So what I'm going to do a voltage drop test on the circuit for the battery, or sorry, for the starter, is I'm going to set my DVOM to volts DC. Okay. And then I'm going to connect my meter leads up. My red meter lead is going to go to the battery, and my black meter lead, and you can hook these up either way, it doesn't really matter. Black meter lead is going to go over here to the B terminal. So if you notice, what I've got is I've got my meter, it's hooked in parallel with just the battery wire. Okay? And when I crank the engine over, what I should see on the DVOM is 0 volts. That's what I should see. Okay, I think you can see up to about half an ohm or something, or half a volt or something like that. You might be able to see that. If this wire has excessive corrosion in it, or resistance or something, you may see more than 0 volts. And so if you see more than, I would say, a couple of millivolts, then you need to look for a bad wire, bad connection, something like that on the battery wire. Okay, now the other connection that we're going to do is we need to do a voltage drop test on the ground circuit. So we'll take our meter leads off from the starter here. And on the ground circuit, what we're going to do is we're just going to take our meter lead from the meter, and we're going to go over here and we're going to touch it to the starter. And then we're going to take our other meter lead, and we're going to go from the meter over here to the negative post of the battery. Okay, and then we're going to crank the engine over. It's important that you have to start, the circuit has to be live in order to do an accurate voltage drop test. So we have to crank the starter over. Remember, I have my remote starter switch hooked up to my starter, so it's really easy to do that. Once I hook my meter up, then I just push the button on my remote starter, crank it over, and I should still see 0 volts. So like I said, you can see just a little bit of voltage, but not very much. If you see 1 volt or more, or even a half a volt or more, you need to start looking for bad connections somewhere along the way. So that's what we're going to do. So now let's go over and take a look at the vehicle, and we'll see how I've got my meter hooked up on the car, and we'll crank the engine over and see what we get. So this is what I've got set up over here. My meter lead, or my meter, I'm going to set it to DC volts. Okay. And then I've got my positive meter lead hooked up to the battery right here, and I've got my negative meter lead hooked up to the starter battery down here. I'll see if I can stuff the camera down in there so you can kind of see it. But the negative meter lead is hooked up right there. And then I've got my remote starter switch hooked up and ready to go. So what we're going to do now is we're going to crank the engine over and watch to see what our voltage drop is. Okay, I've got my meter hooked up, everything's ready to go, and I'm going to push the button, my starter, move over here so that it's in frame. So I'm going to push the button here and crank the engine over, and we'll watch to see how much voltage I'm actually getting on the positive circuit. So that was less than half a volt. So that's acceptable on this particular setup. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set it up same way, only we're going to do the ground circuit now. So I've got my meter all set up now. So I've got 1 meter lead hooked up to the negative cable of the battery right there. And I've got my other meter lead right here. Get it in frame there. So I got this other meter lead. I'm just going to reach down here and I'm going to touch the starter with this meter lead. So it won't be in frame, but that's what I'm doing with it. And then I'm going to push the button on the remote starter to watch to see what my voltage reading is going to be. So I've got my meter lead on the frame of the starter, and here we go. We're going to crank it over. So that's 0.01. So that's acceptable there too. So I don't have any voltage drop there. Like I said, if I find anything more than about a half a volt on either side, the positive or the negative, then I need to start looking for bad connections and different things like that. So that's how you do a voltage drop test on a starter system.